As the sun began to climb higher in the sky, Mrs. Ada called out to her two sons, Emeka and Chukwu, who were busy playing in the compound. Emeka, Chukwu, go to the stream and fetch some water for lunch, she instructed. Emeka, the elder brother, nodded and turned to his younger brother. Let's go, Chukwu. But before they left, their mother added a stern warning. And remember, don't pass through the village river to swim. It's not safe. The boys nodded in unison, and Emeka assured their mother, We won't, Mama. With their clay pots in hand, the brothers set off towards the stream. After fetching the water, they began their journey back home. As they walked, Chukwu suddenly darted ahead of Emeka and ran towards the village river. Chukwu, no! Emeka shouted, but his younger brother didn't listen. Chukwu dropped his clay pot and jumped into the river, laughing and splashing in the water. Emeka shook his head and continued walking home, assuming his younger brother would follow shortly. As Emeka approached their compound, his mother looked up from her cooking and asked, Emeka, where's your brother? Emeka hesitated, thinking Chukwu was already home. I thought he was already here, Mama. He was walking in front of me. Their mother's expression turned concerned. But he's not here. Go and look for him. Emeka's heart began to beat faster as he realized something was amiss. He dropped his clay pot and set off towards the village river, calling out his brother's name. But there was no response. Emeka's anxiety grew as he rushed towards the village river, his heart pounding in his chest. When he arrived, he saw a group of children laughing and splashing in the water. He quickly scanned the area, but there was no sign of Chukwu. Have you guys seen my brother? Emeka asked the other children, trying to keep his voice steady. One of the children, a boy with a messy mop of hair, looked up at Emeka. Oh, you mean Chukwu? Yeah, he was here a few minutes ago. Emeka's eyes widened with hope. Where did he go? The boy shrugged. He left about 30 minutes ago. We thought he was going home. Emeka's anxiety spiked again. If Chukwu had left 30 minutes ago, where was he now? Why hadn't he arrived home yet? Are you sure he didn't say where he was going? Emeka pressed, trying to gather more information. The children shook their heads, and one of them said, No, he just got out of the water and took off. Emeka's mind was racing. He had to find his brother. He thanked the children and began to search the surrounding area, calling out Chukwu's name. But there was only silence. Emeka decided to retrace his steps, wondering if Chukwu might have gone back to the stream. He rushed back to the stream, his eyes scanning the area. But there was no sign of his brother. He searched every possible place he thought Chukwu might be, the nearby bushes, the rocks, the shade trees. He even checked the clay pot they had left behind, thinking maybe Chukwu had returned to fetch it. But Chukwu was nowhere to be found. Emeka's anxiety turned to fear. Where could his brother be? Why hadn't he come home? As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the landscape, Emeka knew he had to return home and tell his mother what had happened. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for the worried look he knew he would see on his mother's face. As he approached their compound, he called out, Mama. His mother emerged from the kitchen, a look of concern etched on her face. Emeka, where's your brother? Emeka shook his head, feeling a lump form in his throat. I couldn't find him, Mama. I looked everywhere. His mother's expression turned grim, and she quickly gathered her wrapper around her. Let's go and search for him. We must find him before nightfall. As they set out to search for Chukwu, Emeka's mother couldn't hide her frustration. Emeka, how could you be so careless? She scolded. You two went to fetch water together, and now you don't know where your brother is. Emeka looked down, feeling ashamed. I'm sorry, Mama. I thought he was right behind me. I didn't see him go off on his own. His mother sighed, her expression softening slightly. Okay, let's focus on finding your brother. We'll search every inch of this village until we find him. They searched high and low, calling out Chukwu's name, but there was no response. They checked the village square, the market, the playground, and even the surrounding farms. But Chukwu was nowhere to be found. As night began to fall, Emeka's mother grew more and more worried. She had never been separated from her children before, and the thought of Chukwu being alone and lost in the dark was unbearable. Let's go back home and get some torches, she said finally. We'll keep searching until we find him. Emeka nodded, feeling a sense of determination wash over him. He was going to find his brother, no matter what it took. As night began to fall, Emika's mother couldn't hold back her tears. She had been searching for her youngest son for hours, and there was still no sign of him. The darkness seemed to closing in around her, and she felt helpless and alone. She wept uncontrollably, her body shaking with sobs. Emika tried to comfort her, but he was scared too. He had never seen his mother like this before. The weight of her responsibility as a single mother bore down on her. Her husband had passed away when Chukwu was just 4 years old, leaving her to care for their two sons on her own. There was no male figure in their lives to provide support or protection. As the night wore on, Emika's mother grew more and more desperate. She had no idea where her son could be or what might have happened to him. The thought of losing him was unbearable. Emika's mother quickly wiped away her tears and set off towards the chief's compound, determined to report her son's disappearance. As she arrived, she noticed another woman, Mrs. Aqua, sitting in front of the chief's hut, crying uncontrollably. The chief, a wise and kind elderly man, looked up and saw Emika's mother. "Ah, Mrs. Ada, what brings you here?" he asked, concern etched on his face. "My son Chukwu is missing," she replied, her voice shaking. "He went to fetch water with his brother, but he never came back." The chief's expression turned grave. "I'm so sorry to hear that, but it seems we have a similar case here. Mrs. Akua's son, Kofi, has also gone missing." Mrs. Akua looked up, her eyes red-rimmed. "Yes, he was swimming in the river with some other children. They said he was there 1 minute, and then he just vanished." Emika's mother's eyes widened. "That's exactly what happened to my son. He was swimming in the river, and then he disappeared." The chief nodded thoughtfully. "It seems we have a mystery on our hands. I'll call the children who were swimming with Kofi and Chukwu to come and testify." The children were summoned, and they told the chief that they had seen Kofi and Chukwu swimming together in the river. However, they couldn't remember where they went or how they got out of the river. "It's as if they just disappeared into thin air," one of the children said, looking puzzled. The chief's face grew serious. "This is indeed a strange and worrying case. I'll gather some men to search the river and the surrounding areas. We must find these children and bring them home safely." As the chief spoke, Emika's mother and Mrs. Aqua exchanged a worried glance. They knew that every minute counted, and they could only hope that their sons would be found soon. The chief summoned some strong men from the village to form a search party. They were instructed to search the village river and its surroundings, and to be careful in case the children had wandered into the nearby forest. The men set off with burning torches, their lights casting flickering shadows on the trees as they made their way to the river. Emika's mother and Mrs. Aqua followed closely behind, their hearts heavy with worry. As they arrived at the river, the men began to search the banks, shining their torches into the darkness. Suddenly, one of the men called out, "I've found something." The others rushed over to see what he had discovered. It was a small slipper, half hidden in the reeds. Emika's mother's heart skipped a beat as she recognized the slipper. It belonged to her son, Chukwu. They couldn't find any sign of the children, but as they searched the surrounding area, it was as if they had vanished into thin air. The men searched up and down the river, calling out the children's names, but there was only silence. The darkness seemed to swallow up the sound of their voices, leaving only an eerie stillness. Emika's mother and Mrs. Aqua exchanged a desperate glance. Where were their children? What had happened to them? The not knowing was almost too much to bear. The search party decided to expand their search to the nearby forest, which was dense and vast. Emika's mother and Mrs. Aqua were hesitant to venture into the forest, but they knew they had to leave no stone unturned. As they entered the forest, the darkness seemed to swallow them whole. The only sound was the rustling of leaves and the snapping of twigs beneath their feet. The men lit more torches, casting flickering shadows on the trees. Emika's mother called out her son's name, her voice echoing through the forest. "Chukwu! Chukwu! Is that you?" But there was only silence. Mrs. Aqua was searching nearby, her eyes scanning the underbrush. Suddenly, she let out a cry. "What's that?" she exclaimed, pointing to something on the ground. The others rushed over to see what she had found. It was a piece of cloth, torn and dirty. Emika's mother's heart skipped a beat as she recognized the fabric. "That's from Chukwu's shirt," she whispered. The search party exchanged nervous glances. What did this mean? Had Chukwu and Kofi wandered into the forest? And if so, where were they now? But what really happened? Earlier that day, Kofi had convinced Chukwu to follow him to a secret spot where the juiciest fruits grew. Excited by the prospect of adventure and sweet treats, Chukwu had eagerly agreed. They had set off, laughing and joking, but as they wandered deeper into the forest, the trees seemed to close in around them. Despite Kofi's reassurances, Chukwu began to feel uneasy. The forest was denser than he had ever seen before, and the sounds of the village were fading into the distance. As the afternoon wore on, the boys realized they were lost. They had been walking for hours, but the forest seemed to stretch on forever. Panic began to set in as they frantically searched for a path back home. But it was too late. The sun was dipping below the horizon, casting the forest in a dark, eerie light. Kofi and Chukwu were alone, scared, and lost in the heart of the forest. As night began to fall, they stumbled upon a river, its calm surface reflecting the stars above. Exhausted and desperate, they decided to follow the river, hoping it would lead them back to civilization. But as they waded into the water, the current swept them away, separating them in the darkness. Kofi and Chukwu were torn from each other's grasp, their cries echoing through the forest as they were carried downstream, alone and frightened. As the darkness closed in around him, Kofi's fear turned to panic. He had always been scared of the dark, and now he was alone, lost, and adrift in a river. He couldn't see anything, and the only sounds he could hear were the rushing water and his own ragged breathing. Kofi began to weep, great sobs racking his small body. He was so scared, and he didn't know how he would ever find his way back home. He thought of his mother, and he wondered if he would ever see them again. As he floated downstream, Kofi's tears mingled with the river water. He was cold, hungry, and exhausted, and he just wanted to go home. He cried out for his mother, for his father, for anyone who could hear him and come to his rescue. But his cries were swallowed up by the darkness, and Kofi was left alone with his fears. He didn't know what would happen to him next, or if he would ever find his way out of this terrifying place. All he could do was keep floating, and hope that somehow, someway, he would make it through the night. Let's go back to Chukwu. Chukwu trudged through the dense underbrush, his heart racing with every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves. He was scared, but he was determined to find his way home. As he walked, Chukwu called out for Kofi, but there was no response. He was alone, and the darkness seemed to be closing in around him. Despite his fear, Chukwu kept moving, his eyes scanning the surroundings for any familiar landmark. He had been walking for what felt like hours, but he knew he couldn't give up. Suddenly, Chukwu stumbled upon a narrow path, barely visible in the fading light. He hesitated for a moment, wondering if he should follow it, but something about it seemed familiar. With a surge of hope, Chukwu set off down the path, his heart pounding in his chest. Would it lead him home, or deeper into the forest? Meanwhile, the search party led by Okoro gathered at the edge of the forest. They had been searching for hours, but there was no sign of the missing boys. Okoro turned to the mothers, who were visibly exhausted and worried. Ladies, it's getting dark. Why don't you go home and get some rest? We'll continue the search and make sure to find your boys. Chukwu's mother nodded, tears streaming down her face. Please, find my son. I'll be waiting at home. Kofi's mother clutched her husband's arm, her eyes wide with fear. What if something happens to him? Okoro placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. We'll do everything we can to find them. Go home, get some rest, and let us do our job. The mothers reluctantly agreed, and the men continued their search. As they ventured deeper into the forest, they called out the boys' names, but there was only silence. Just as they were about to give up for the night, one of the men heard a faint rustling in the bushes. Wait, he whispered, his eyes scanning the darkness. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows. Chukwu! Okoro exclaimed, rushing to the boy's side. Where's Kofi? Chukwu's eyes locked onto Okoro's and he tried to speak, but his voice was barely a whisper. He gestured weakly with his hand, trying to convey something, but Okoro couldn't understand. Where's Kofi? Okoro asked again, his voice gentle but urgent. Chukwu's eyes filled with tears, and he nodded, still trying to speak, but his words were lost in a faint whisper. Okoro's face set in determination. We'll find him, he promised Chukwu. We won't give up. The men quickly tended to Chukwu's wounds and gave him water to drink, but despite Chukwu's weak attempts to communicate, they couldn't get a clear direction on where Kofi might be. Undeterred, the men decided to continue the search, scouring the forest and calling out Kofi's name. They knew time was running out, and they had to find Kofi before nightfall. As they combed through the dense underbrush, their flashlights casting eerie shadows on the trees, they stumbled upon the river. Its calm surface reflected the stars above, and the men's hearts sank. Had Kofi fallen into the river? Was he swept away by the current? Without hesitation, the men began to search along the riverbank, their voices echoing through the night as they called out Kofi's name. As they searched along the riverbank, their flashlights casting flickering shadows on the water, they suddenly heard a faint cry for help. "Kofi!" one of the men shouted, his voice echoing across the river. "Is that you?" The cry came again, weaker this time but unmistakable. The men quickly located the source of the sound and rushed to the water's edge. There, clinging to a partially submerged log, was Kofi. His eyes were sunken, his skin pale, and his body shivering with fear and cold. Without hesitation, the men plunged into the water, wading through the chest-deep river to reach Kofi. They carefully lifted him from the log and carried him back to the riverbank. As they laid him down on the grassy shore, Kofi's eyes fluttered open, and he gazed up at the men. A faint smile crossed his lips, and he whispered, "Thank you." The men breathed a collective sigh of relief as they wrapped Kofi in a blanket and tended to his wounds. They knew they had to get him and Chukwu back to the village, where their families would be overjoyed to see them safe and sound. As they made their way back through the forest, the men couldn't help but feel a sense of pride and gratitude. They had worked together to find the missing boys, and their efforts had paid off. The villagers would be celebrating late into the night, giving thanks for the safe return of Kofi and Chukwu.